Math is not useful in League currently in that complicated statistical models don't provide anything useful or beyond the obvious. The League community suggests some interesting uses for models, but in particular, it's really hard to isolate what one individual player does to win or lose the game. So far, only actually Dota 2 has implemented a project that gets something interesting and new out of complicated math. But when I say these stats are useless, like what would it mean for them to be useful? So I think either for scouting players or for finding mistakes to fix, if a model improves on actually watching someone play or even supplements watching them, then it's useful. And when I say model, what a model means, I think, in League should be like taking in player data in a game and telling you how they contribute to winning or losing the game. So, for instance, this model claims to increase your rank. Now, maybe the claim is that it tells you what's important in a game, which would otherwise be sort of too subtle for you to figure out on your own. But now the model can tell you what to do better and you can improve. But I'm not convinced that it actually does that and helps anyone win their games. And obviously, alternatively, it might just be a pun on ranking that the author doesn't expect anyone to take seriously. So let's take a closer look at this model. It's a black box, meaning they don't really explain like how they train it or what it's doing internally. You just feed it player data and it does magic and it tells you which team probably wins the game. And the thing about a black box is like we just don't understand it. If we're going to make a more complicated model that we don't understand, that should be an exchange for like better accuracy or something. So for example, like if it's able to like really accurately classify like stoplights and kids and bikes and all that stuff, like that might be worth making it more complicated. Whereas if we use a more complicated model for League and it doesn't predict win-loss more accurately than like KDA or something simple, really simple like that, like the simple ways that humans just use a very basic stat like KDA to like judge performance in like one number in half a second. If we're not improving on that sort of simple stat, we should probably take a step back and say like, what is making it more complicated to actually get us, and like, is it worth the black box? So this black box gets 82% accuracy, meaning if you give it 100 examples of like player champions, matchups, kills, gold, all the stuff it uses, it'll tell you probably like 82 win or loss outcomes correctly, which is way better than the 50 you get from flipping a coin. But before we get into the complicated stuff, though, it's worth like just the very simple like median KDA and say, okay, if we have a KDA greater than like the median KDA of 2, we predict win. And if they have a KDA less than the median KDA of 2, we predict loss. And that gets 80% accuracy. And of course, League players are nothing if not competitive, so let's squeeze out a few more points of accuracy. So we can separate the players into 5 roles. And actually, this was mostly done already. But as a quick note, the article, they originally only used player rows where the role could be determined. And I mean, could be determined as passive voice. And in this case, it was like Riot doing the determining. And like Riot can't tell the difference between Yumi and a jungler, but like I can. So I went and fixed those. And it seemed like usually Riot would only get all 5 roles correct sometimes. Like for instance, a Bard or a Yumi or something would be like roaming a lot, so Riot would decide they're a jungler. But yeah, like I manually fixed those games in the data set. And actually, I can't stress this enough to credit to the author for including her data set as part of the article. It makes the work much more interesting in the sense that you can actually play with it yourself and extend it. So credit to the author there, and I will do that as well in the description here and link the data set. So yeah, it's great she included the data set. Anyway, we've separated the players by role, top, jungle, middle, bottom, utility. So now we can get the median KDA for each role rather than the median KDA overall and compare players to the median KDA for their role. And this gets us up to 81% accuracy exactly, so it's a slight improvement. And the first really interesting thing I noticed, by the way, is that support and jungle tended to have really high KDAs and wins, and the predictions were way more accurate for those roles, like 85% accurate. And so you could read this 2 ways, like either maybe support and jungle are just more impactful roles in the sense that if you perform well and have a higher KDA, your team is more likely to win, because you perform well. compared to the other roles. Or what it could mean is that support and jungle are more affected by how the rest of the team is doing in terms of KDA. So like if you're on a winning team, it's easy to have a really high KDA as a support or a jungler because you're just participating in a lot of kills and the other team will be weak and not kill you. So the causation could go either way on the winning and KDA thing, but support and jungle KDA is much more correlated with the game's outcome. And meanwhile, top lane is just like an island. The author originally created a 10 gold opponent column to measure if you win lane by comparing your gold at 10 minutes to your opponent's gold at 10 minutes. And it turns out this is only somewhat correlated with winning the game, so I found that the player who won lane won 60% of the games. But that's not close to the 82% we're going for. And so if instead you compare your gold to your counterpart at the end of the game, that one does better. You have 79.5% accuracy. And the reason for this is the stats that perform best here are the ones that are most correlated with winning, not necessarily the ones that best isolate your individual performance, which is an important distinction and sort of makes it seem unfair to compare a stat like your deaths or your KDA across the entire game to your gold difference at 10 minutes to your counterpart, because the stat at the end of the game is going to be much more influenced by your team. And the whole point of restricting what we're looking at to the one individual player was to get a sense of how the individual player's performance affects the chance of winning or losing. So if we start getting more of the team information, maybe it defeats the purpose of that a little bit. But we can do that anyways. So we could actually just look at your change in gold from 10 minutes to the end of the game. So how much gold you earned from 10 minutes until the game ends. And say if you earn more gold from 10 minutes until the end of the game than your lane counterpart, we predict a win. And this actually turns out to be even more accurate than gold at the end of the game, even though we sort of took out the information about if you won lane or not. And this is almost 82%, and then we can get it to 82% with one like slightly sketchy change. It makes sense though. So when you use gold earned, Pyke is like a totally different champion than everyone else because his ult just gives like thousands of gold, bonus gold like every game if he executes people with like the right way to think of Pyke as a champion is like he's kind of useless. All he can do is kill people, but like he gives your team like a giant gold lead for killing people. So we just chop off like a 2,000 gold Pyke tax if you play Pyke, or give you like a 2,000 gold standard deduction if Pyke is on your enemy team. Is like, so like if you're playing mid or support and you're against a Pyke, we say okay, you get a bonus 2,000 gold. And so now this function predicts 4,106 out of the 5,000 games, so this gets us to 82%. By looking at the gold earned from 10 minutes to the end of the game, we've tried to get a sense of how your team is doing, even though we're just looking at your individual stats. Like, it actually helps to take your laning out of the equation, which is interesting. The big sort of red flag that what we're doing here is looking at how the team's overall state influences you and not how you influence your team. But even with other models, there's the same danger of optimizing for stats that reflect how your team is performing and not just you individually. So like even your KDA is to some extent determined by your team. Like as a thought experiment, I bet if you took your KDA in the last 5 or 10 minutes of the game and used that to predict who wins or loses, you do really, really well. Much better than if you use your KDA in the first 5 minutes of the game. And that's not necessarily because how well you do at the end of the game is more important for like improving or, getting better at the game or demonstrating skill or whatever. It's just more correlated with if your team is winning or losing. So mainly this model is not asking like what does playing well look like, but rather what does being on the winning team look like, so it doesn't really follow that lowering deaths is more important than winning lane for climbing. It just means that when you're on the winning team, you'll have lower deaths because lower deaths are more correlated with winning than winning lane is, but like it's also more influenced by your team by some amount than winning lane. So yeah, we have a bunch of ways of predicting who wins, and by manually putting together our model of what stats matter, we learn exactly how we're using them. Like, for instance, if someone is a mid laner and we can compare their KDA to 1.9, the median mid KDA, we know exactly what we're doing. Or like we check if you've got more gold since 10 minutes than your counterpart and say then you probably won, we know what we're doing. And obviously the black box, by contrast, we don't really know how it works, which is the very obvious downside. And when our goal is to not merely make predictions, but also learn which factors are important, that becomes more of a downside. And so what they do is they say these are the features that have the most weight. And like the highest influence or whatever. But because we don't know what their model is doing internally, like it's hard to say what influence means for them other than like, I don't know, it's correlated with the outcome somehow. Whereas when we make our own simple prediction, we know how we calculate KDA and median KDA for role and all that stuff. Whereas with the black box, presumably it's doing something similar, but who knows? Like, I don't know. So, at least I don't know what it's doing internally when it like puts a higher weight on one factor than another, or like what the influence scores really mean, because we just don't know how their model works. So, I mean, the advantage of using a complicated and opaque model would be that it could take a lot of features and figure out which ones are important or are not important, and figure out all the like complicated relationships between the features and the win or loss on its own. But like as the author notes, she expected like champion matchups or all this random stats that she included maybe could matter, but it turns out like all those stuff, they just didn't matter. So like she just threw away those features. Now, like if including matchups and bans and blah blah blah, like if all that did help predict outcomes more accurately, I think that would justify using a more complicated model, because then your model would be saying something like non-obvious about who wins that you can't see simply by looking at people's KDAs. But like here, it turns out adding more features did not help. We can predict who wins almost as accurately, like using the simple KDA approach, and like you can get the same accuracy by looking at gold after 10 minutes. But really, what we ended up learning was that like it's more about your team's performance than your own. So it seems like it's like not worth it to bother with the complicated model, because there's no like benefit to adding additional features. Now it might just be that like the sample is too small for the black box to do its complicated magic, and if you trained it in like 1,000,000 games, it would become more accurate. I don't know. Like it's certainly true that you would see champion matchups more often then, but to me it seems like the complicated model doesn't really benefit from adding more features, and has the drawback of like not really knowing what it means when a feature influences win rate. So it's technically like not wrong to say that decreasing your deaths makes you more likely to win the game than like winning your lane in terms of having more gold than your lane opponent, but like it's also very useless to say that, because it could be like a big part of how you decrease your endgame death count is getting better teammates and worse enemy players, and we don't really know what the complicated model does with deaths exactly, but like probably it's not really doing anything to account for how your team is doing. So the point of all of this is that the complicated model doesn't really get us anything. Like it's harder to understand what it's doing than the naive approach. We don't really know exactly what it's doing, but it doesn't predict like the game outcome better or yield useful insights. So anyway, let's talk about baseball. And by the way, I've never played baseball in my life, or like even like watched a full game. In my mind, like only old people like baseball, and like even they don't actually, like they don't watch it. They just sort of like go. It's like where old people would like go to socialize before the internet was invented. But the point is, anyway, baseball is like a sport where like statistical models like actually matter. Like what having complicated statistics actually do something for you looks like, which is really cool for us, because it's like an example of what you need to do to have meaningful data and models for how to win and how to value players, which, as I was saying at the beginning, is what would happen in League if this stuff worked. So the story of Moneyball you can get from the book or the movie, but I'll tell you like the exaggerated movie version, which is like there are these sort of dumb old scouts who went around trying to find talented young baseball players, but like they didn't really know what like matters in a baseball player, so they were just like well, this guy runs fast. He seems like he's got a big dick, or like let's just sign him for $1 million. But then like some nerds came along and were like, well, actually, this like fat ass who's but he gets on base, and so blah blah blah. He'll create 17 more runs over the season. Divide by the square root of negative pi, blah blah blah. And so it turns out the nerds are right, and the baseball player contracts also got really expensive, which like forced the teams to value their players accurately. And so now baseball is run by nerds or whatever. So for instance, you can see the parallel to League. The revolution in baseball. By the way, I was joking. It's actually like not like weird dorky nerds, but like people who just genuinely want to understand how to value players. Especially Bill James was the big one. That revolution in baseball was like figuring out which stats are important to winning, or like performing well in games and understanding player trajectory. So, for instance, people used to care about like runs batted in and batting average, but it turned out those stats are not actually like a good measure of what a player is contributing, and on-base percentage is more important. Or like people used to scout high school baseball players, even though college baseball players were more likely to succeed. And I mean, like I said, I don't know, baseball is boring, but hopefully those examples are like not completely off base. The point here is just like for League, someone would come along with stats and say like, actually, like this is the stat you should be looking for to see what wins games, or like if you should sign players based on this. And so far in League, nothing like improves on or even sort of supplements watching games, I think, for like practice and scouting. I might be wrong about this, since if a team did have a competitive advantage, they would of course like keep it private, while publicly saying like, yeah, we like to look at support CSD and vision scores or whatever. But I feel like if you can watch a game and get a sense of how good someone is and how they play like that way, there's nothing to be gained from like models. Whereas in baseball, it turned out stats tell you much more about how good they are than you know from just watching them play for a bit. And here I think Oracle's Elixir is worth mentioning, because they do a lot of stats for storytelling, which casters like to do. But specifically, one article I really, really liked, which honestly says most of what I'm saying here better, already. So I don't know what I'm even doing here. You can just go read that article. I'll link it. But the point of that article was originally to find some sort of advanced stat, like what I was saying, to value players, to judge how well players are performing. But it turns out advanced stats don't really get us as much in League as in baseball, which is sort of what basically covers what I'm saying. So to highlight one quote, we don't have advanced statistics in LoL because we lack the necessary precision and statistical measurement. And the article explains how stats in baseball measure a player's individual skill, and those don't really exist in League. So like to do this, those stats have to control for stuff like what park they're playing in. And I also think in baseball there are a lot of individual skill checks, like can you hit a ball or can you catch a ball? I think that's baseball. And like these are naturally very isolated from your teammates. Whereas in League, it's always like a 5v5 game. You're never just sort of alone, like in the practice tool, trying to get perfect CS or something. Like in a real game, you're always, like getting fucked by your support's positioning, or like getting dove by the enemy jungler, or grouping or whatever. It's always something where it's really hard to isolate like your individual skill checks. And so it's really easy to say, well, your KDA at the end of the game is correlated with win rate, so we'll judge your performance that way. But like the problem with these stats is like it probably reflects all the players in the game, not just your own individual performance. So you can't really use them to compare one player with like a mediocre replacement player in the same way you could in baseball. And other sports are like easier to get good data on than League for a bunch of reasons. Like in other sports, like positions tend to be repeated more, and there's less variety in game state, and the game doesn't change from game to game because like, imagine some writers decided goalies in soccer shouldn't get to use their hands anymore in like the new patch or whatever. But also, at least according to Moneyball, data collection in baseball used to suck, and it took the sustained and like concentrated wrath of Bill James and a bunch of just companies unaffiliated with the sort of stubbornly like Dark Ages official league to change anything. So, for instance, like one of Bill James's complaints, was that it's wrong to record it as an error simply because someone failed to catch a ball, because it shows also that they were in the right position in the first place. And the point is, historically, it wasn't just that baseball fans suddenly learned to do math or something. They also started collecting better data and really thinking about which data is meaningful in terms of like what a player does to create value for their team. And sort of like this article says, that measurement of players really isn't present in league. So we're just not collecting the right data, or cannot collect the data that reflects the individual player skill checks. So the question is, what can we do now in League? And one answer is to create stats for players by only looking at their laning phase. So we could say, well, who knows if this Baker guy is a good player in general, but he overperforms in lane by this much. And the hope here is that laning phase is more isolated from the rest of the team, so you could just control for stuff and in a manageable way and see how someone does without getting it completely confounded by the teams. Another sort of project I think people like to do is say, like, given a certain game state with like these 10 champions and their gold, items, levels, dragons, whatever, like predict who will win the game. And I'm not sure how much better these projects tend to be than simply predicting the team with a gold lead will win. But like assuming they're actually good, this is interesting because if we have like these two game states, and in the first one, blue team has like a 60% chance to win, and then in the second one, blue team has like a 65% chance to win, we could compare them and see what changed, and like maybe attribute that to an individual player and determine the value they create that way. And this sort of corresponds to how you as a human can review a game by like looking at the gold graph and seeing who killed who before gold swings. And tentatively, I think something interesting, you could have like the concept of like a valuable takedown where like if there's like a big gold swing after killing someone, you could assign more value to that kill, which sort of addresses the problem of value creation the article brings up. But then it's like, well, what if the enemy jungler comes and like zones the bot lane off the tower but doesn't kill them, and you'd miss that play with that stat, even though it could be really valuable. Or, it's hard to say like who creates a kill. So yeah, I don't know how feasible it is to say anything about individual players. But taking a team game, like a team state, and saying they have like a 79% chance to win or whatever, that's something people have done and I think should keep doing because, like I said, I don't know how much it improves over just like using the gold lead or something, but it does give us, if it does work, a better sense of what's important for winning. I was actually just going to leave this here. This was going to be the end. I was just going to be like, yeah, complicated math doesn't really get us anything in League, blah, blah, blah. But then I was like, oh, right. Well, duh, someone actually did an amazing project that actually works and gets us something really cool. Not in League, but in Dota, which is, very close. So OpenAI trained an agent to play Dota 2 and beat the best pros. And honestly, it's just one of the coolest results sort of out there. A product of like a whole team of people who really like know what they're doing and have a ton of compute resources. And they just made an agent to play Dota, which is really incredible. So their paper is interesting. So for one thing, I was suggesting the model would learn what factors are important for winning League on its own. Like you just tell it to kill their Nexus and it learns you need to get gold or dragons or whatever. But that's not what OpenAI did. They instead trained by maximizing the reward function, which probably makes sense. It helps to tell the model it's good to get gold and XP and stuff. And then they have to do some tweaking of this reward function. Like for instance, to say that, okay, you get way more gold for stuff late game than you do early game, so you have to weight the early game gold more heavily to prevent the model from like only focusing on the late game gold. But they make this reward function themselves and just sort of leave it as the model trains. And then they have sort of parameters like team spirit to weight how the individual players' actions affect rewards for their own character. It's a hero in Dota, not a champion, versus how it affects the rest of the team. And they had this team spirit parameter low at first to just learn mechanics, like the basic gameplay, and then ramped it up to like 1 by the end. Meaning the rewards were sort of looking at the whole team and not just the individual hero. And so anyway, one of the challenges people brought up for League in the responses to the Oracle's Elixir article, I think, is the game changes every patch. Sometimes really significant changes. Sometimes even human pros struggle to constantly relearn how to play the game. And OpenAI trained their agent over a long period, which included patches to Dota. So they did what they call model surgery, which really blew my mind because I've never heard of it before. Literally, while they were training their model, they just stopped and manually went in and fixed it somehow to reflect patch changes, and then just kept training it further. And I should back up and say the way they train this model is they have it play against itself for previous versions, and it takes a game state and chooses an action, like attacking a minion or a creep in Dota or whatever. And the result of that action goes into the reward function, which then says if it was good or bad. And that, I think, changes the model weights, which are used to choose actions in the future. But honestly, I might be wrong, but this is more than I'm familiar with. But so anyway, it's crazy to me that they could do surgery, they call it, on the model, add in a bunch of new changes for the new observations that are not present in previous patches. They add these new observations without you losing the skills learned in these parameters so far. I've just never heard of that before, and would not have imagined it in something other than a situation where you have to train a model that learns to play a game, but a new item or new ability is nerfed or something while you're training it. But also, I think transfer learning is a thing today, although I've never done anything with it myself. So Wikipedia says you can start with a trained model and then it learns to do a different but related task. So it could recognize cars and then learn to recognize trucks. And this sounds like what you would want for one day Dota or League, a model that can play on patch 12.6, and then when 12.7 comes out, you don't have to retrain it from scratch or even manually do surgery on it. You would just train it on 12.7 automatically somehow. But obviously, this is talking out of my butt. I clearly have not implemented this. And also the OpenAI paper was from 2019, so maybe they would use transfer learning today. I don't know. But back to the agent they actually created for Dota. One thing they did was make it predict if it would win or lose a game in a given game state. And like I said, I don't think they used this for training the model. They had it maximize their own fairly simple reward function. But that prediction is interesting just in itself and also for drafting. For one thing, they sort of note that the model improved at predicting the outcome as it itself improved. It also just got better at recognizing which situations lead to win or losing the game, which sort of I feel matches how better human players are better at predicting game outcomes from situations. But yeah, in drafting heroes, this is pretty cool. Use the model, the same model that plays the game and predicts which team will win. They use that to decide which champions are good to draft. Heroes. By seeing which team it would predict to win, given those champion heroes at the beginning of the game. I kind of wonder if their agent could be used to measure human player performance, in the same way, in chess, the computer can tell you if a decision is good or not by how it changes your chance to win. Maybe OpenAI could do that, in-game at a very, very, fine-grained level of, even, failing to hit a minion or something. And in a way, it already does that in the drafting phase, because it says, if it thinks your hero picks are correct or not. But, it sort of values heroes differently in some cases than humans do. So, anyway, OpenAI is very cool and an example of complicated math actually getting something. This is only tangentially related to the first model I was looking at, the black box, but I wanted to finish by saying it's not okay to shill for stuff on the leak subreddit. And of course, the leak sub is terrible in many ways. There's dumb comments, very tired memes, silly rules, very tedious rules, following the whole site rules, very insulting tones and exchanges. And I'm probably guilty of some, of this stuff myself. It is what it is. And of course, there's self-promotion inherent in posting anything you do to the subreddit, and like that's fine. But the line between that and like deliberately pretending to be unaffiliated with like a product in order to promote it is really important, because of the question of like who can you trust on the internet. For some stuff, if you like Google like best mattress or whatever, what you'll get is content promoted by companies to sell their mattresses, which is just how it goes, because there's like money to be made in advertising mattresses, and not many people who just want to like try all the different mattresses for fun and like leave unbiased reviews. But the point is, like, the internet is full of people advertising to you, and one really valuable thing about forums is they're a safe haven from that, and like you're interacting with another human being and not like someone trying to sell you something. Even if they're like promoting their stream with their cool play or whatever, it's at least clear who they are and like what they're promoting. So I was sort of disappointed to read a lot of comments that like it seemed like they didn't have much like substance to them, sort of weird grammar, and generally did not sound like a human saying something. So I asked someone who had like a ton, like 30 or whatever, however many comments on that post, like if they were like friends with the author or something. On its own, like that would be okay, but it doesn't really answer if they're like affiliated with the company or not. But there are these like accounts that like randomly decided to type the letters AI in the comments, which is either like deranged insanity typing or like autocorrect or something, but maybe some sort of weird attempt to like optimize search engines so that when you Google like League of Legends AI, this post comes up. And there are all these accounts commenting on this article that haven't commented on like anything League related at all since they were created, but they all recommended you buy toys from some website a while ago. By the way, if you want to buy action figures, my hunch is like don't buy from the site that these accounts all decided is a reputable action figure shipper seller, but who knows, maybe it is. And also the same article was posted on an orange forum where it got a few sort of similarly like inane comments posted on the article. So I don't know. I think someone is trying to like growth hack their AI as a service or whatever. And like, I don't know. To be clear, it's fine if you want to say, look, I made something cool. And like, it is genuinely a very cool like topic. But like, you should say if you're affiliated with the company when you start commenting on the article and bringing in additional accounts to comment, because otherwise you're sort of being sneaky to manipulate the post. But anyway, it's not my job to be an internet janitor, so I don't know. Please just post your cool stuff and say it's your own thing and comment with your own account. It's all good. Speaking of community standards, I think it would be a good thing to have like a common data set of games with stuff like, people's gold and levels and dragons and whatever through the game, their champions, all that, so that when people do projects predicting which team wins or whatever, they would all be on this common data set to sort of compare and use as a benchmark, so you could see how much value each project adds.